Is it recording? There it is. We are recording. So, hello, Bly. Hello, Christopher. Thank you for joining me for this arbitrated debate over whether fish, particularly goldfish, are conscious. Bly, you are making the argument that goldfish are conscious. Would you like to begin?
I would like to begin. I think, we have to look at those. We start off by looking at those basic characteristics, right? Wakefulness, awareness, responsiveness. And I would like to start off by looking through the lens of my own personal experience with goldfish, as well as the words of Thomas Nagel. Nagel makes the point in his discussions that that reality is subjective, perception is subjective, and that is the key for understanding your consciousness. In my case, I would refer to Happy. Happy was my goldfish when I was 5 years old. He was a lovely fish. He swam around his bowl. He would often breach the surface and jump in the bowl. Hence, I called him Happy. I would argue that Happy's jumping was a sign of his consciousness because he was curious about what lied beyond what was beyond the goldfish bowl. I make this point because Happy eventually, in his quest for knowledge, committed suicide. He leapt out of his bowl, fell behind the couch, and that was it. We found him like 3 weeks after his death. But the point being is Happy leaping out and committing suicide from his goldfish, from his goldfish bowl, is either a sign of his curiosity of what was behind the couch. He was seeking answers for the world outside of the goldfish bowl, or it was some existential crisis concerning, his life inside the goldfish bowl. One of the two. But the fact of the matter is, from his perspective, from his point of view within the goldfish bowl, he could see a world outside. And his consistent jumping and leaping outside of the bowl expressed a desire to understand the world around him. And it did lead to his death. But a good number of human explorers have also met a similar fate. So my conclusion, Happy's actions showed that he was interested in knowing and understanding the environment around him. Therefore, he had a consciousness. He was able to perceive a world within the goldfish bowl. He was able to perceive a world from without, which was outside of the goldfish bowl. And by extrapolation, if Happy was conscious, then goldfish are conscious creatures. And that would be my first argument, the Happy argument.
Oh, that's a very lofty concept of consciousness. I did not expect that at all. I was expecting like, oh, he's responsive. I could tap on the glass and he responds. I was thinking we were going for a very low level of consciousness, but you proposed a
much deeper,
very deeper, where we have a consciousness both of here and there, of inside and outside, and also you've kept emphasizing this notion of curiosity. Do you think curiosity is an essential part of consciousness?
I think curiosity is an essential key to being a conscious being. You can respond to stimuli, and all sorts of things respond to stimuli. But the moment of having to understand a here and a there and what is there, that's a moment where there is a suggestion of introspection, a suggestion of thought, of internal thinking. And therefore, that curiosity, a driving goal of knowing what is there, is I believe, a key factor for consciousness.
So this is a sort of a specialized response to stimuli, where and it's actually a sensitivity to different kinds of stimuli, the known and the unknown, the familiar and the great. Because to be curious, you have to know what to be curious about. You need to be aware of these different sorts of things that there are to perceive, and then have this response of, I want to check that out, which is, that is not what I expected from a goldfish at all. So
it's one of those experiences that you see and you understand, and certainly that struck me, and it's always been in my head about Happy for 45 years of 45 years of life now. So yeah.
So consciousness is for you. Tell me if I'm wrong, but for you, consciousness is a sort of proactive awareness, where you're not just passively taking in information, you're engaging with the world outside of you to the extent that you're able to, and you're curious about that world to the extent that you're able to be.
Yes,
all right, cool.
That would be my first point. Yes.
All right. Did you have a second point?
I do have a second point when it deals with, for example, we bring it back to what fish feel. Jeremy Bentham made the point that it's not so important whether animals talk or if they reason, but the importance is, do they suffer? And experiments that have been done in an article published by the Smithsonian earlier in the year, they made the point that fish typically respond to outside stimuli by being wary, by getting away from outside stimuli to judge whether they're safe or not. And that fish response to outside stimuli are change whether the fish are in pain or not. If you inject a fish with acid, light acid that gives them pain, they start ignoring stimuli, outside stimuli. So for example, when something new is introduced to the tank, a normal fish will stay away from it. A fish in pain doesn't really pay attention and realize and doesn't pay attention to outside stimuli in the same way. A fish in pain given morphine begins responding to outside stimuli again. And they're also putting out the same sorts of dopamines and such that mammals do when we're in pain. So the suggestion would be that they respond to suffering. Fish do respond to suffering. And from Bentham's perspective, that would also suggest that they have a consciousness. They understand that they are in pain and they are suffering.
Okay, so this is much more what I expected, a much lower threshold, right? The ability to feel pain. So I think you're actually kind of giving us a pretty wide range of
very wide range, yes.
Like brainstem, aware of being hurt to curiosity about the world. You've given us a wide range into which the fish fits. All right, cool.
Yes.
Cool.
That was my point.
Christopher.
Happy had a soul.
Oh, go ahead.
I said happy had a soul. I am convinced.
Happy had a soul. All right, we're good. All right, Christopher, what's your rebuttal on this whole fish fiasco?
Okay, so my first argument, and it is sort of a direct rebuttal to this, is first, Bly had mentioned the fish's curiosity, or the perception of the fish's curiosity as an indicator of its consciousness. And what he had mentioned was Nagel's argument that inner states and other beings are inherently unknowable, ineluctably alien. The issue here is that this term consciousness is really meaningless when we apply it to a goldfish. While we may say that a chair is conscious, should we ascribe this term to a goldfish? This is not to say that it doesn't feel pain, that it can't learn, that it doesn't react. A tree may well react to harm from the environment by releasing sap, etc., to fight insects, for instance. We can only say from the goldfish's reactions, though, that can be explained merely by behavioralist conditioning and doesn't necessarily correlate or indicate awareness. But we do need a clear indication first of what we mean by consciousness. To think that a goldfish is conscious of what? Of the magnificence of the sublime, the aesthetics of shadows, of the brevity and limits of its own nature. Is there not tragedy in its being? There is no consciousness in its insect mind.
You just described happy right
there. We can also ask what sort of consciousness we're really talking about. Are all conscious states equal? Are there degrees of consciousness? Are we talking about an either-or proposition? So if we are speaking of consciousness as an empirical feature of physical beings, we need to examine the goldfish from a biological perspective. That is, unless we believe consciousness is a transcendental, mysterious, spooky property of the universe, one which magically interacts with matter. We need to look at the seat of consciousness, the brain. Quite simply, the argument is that goldfish lack sufficient brain complexity to be considered consciousness in terms of how we are using the word. So Bly mentioned wakefulness, but of course this exists in degrees. A goldfish is aware, but how aware? This raises the question as to what we mean as humans are referring to as consciousness. We are of course reacting to our own inner qualitative subjective perception of consciousness that is contextualized within a specific material, biological, and cultural environment. In this case, our materialist scientific culture. And we can think about how this question and our expectations for an answer could vary or differ if we are speaking from the viewpoint of a majority religious society with different expectations, assumptions, and definitions of what counts as conscious. So what we really mean, therefore, is higher consciousness, not just conscious experience. Okay, so what does a goldfish actually have? So while a goldfish has a hippocampus linked to learning, spatial memory, this sort of thing, and amygdala linked to emotions, is this what creates consciousness? right? What happens if consciousness is part of the cerebellum? Well, we know from studies of people with brain injuries that they can suffer significant aspects of brain injury that alter their personality, that alter other aspects of their characteristics. But does this impact their consciousness? Almost not at all. Someone may lose an ability such as the ability to dance or the ability to write in calligraphy, but their sense of processing consciousness remains fine and they remain conscious. So what about this specific mechanism, the cerebral cortex? The goldfish has no cerebral cortex. What this means is that a goldfish is unable to produce the integrated, sustained, variable processes and modeling that bring together memory, imagination, expectations, reflection, self-awareness, prediction, and conscious awareness into a process of wakefulness. Can a goldfish know the Buddha? Can a goldfish practice Zen? Can a goldfish experience, seek, and sometimes control different states of conscious awareness? In this sense, the goldfish, while they have conscious experiences, is not a sustained and integrated whole and can therefore not be said to be any more conscious than a tree.
Oh,
Okay.
so this is
How dare you, sir?
You seem to have a very mechanistic, sort of functionalistic approach to this goldfish. So I first of all, I really appreciate how you did a lot of my work for me, exploring like the various ways we could define consciousness and how that impacts this. But bringing this around, then you seem to be defining consciousness as an emergent property, right? We have these little robotic bits, just like the tree responding with sap. That's a mechanism, right? It's automatic as opposed to a conscious choosing agency type thing.
Exactly.
So the goldfish has all of those automatic processes, but it doesn't have that emergent quality of consciousness that is aware of all of those things going on and sort of, I think Dennett would call it the conversation of the functions, right? Where all of these little things are talking to each other, and you have to have consciousness. You have to have this really complex brain to make sense of all of those different parts and to sort of prioritize all of the different commands, whereas the fish has way simpler commands that it has to deal with: flight or fight. Should I have sex with that or eat that? Or will it eat me? That like basically covers the entire fish gamut of awareness of the outside world. All right, so I think did I miss anything important on there, Christopher?
No, I think that was mostly it. That a fish lacks the capacity to integrate these into a function that we would call consciousness.
Okay, so I think that we can. So we've set a very lofty standards here. This is the consciousness, the sort of anthropocentric consciousness. You're saying, can a fish do all of these things that human beings can do? It's like, well, no, a fish cannot appreciate the Buddha. And I think we all agree, Bly and Christopher, a fish cannot achieve that anthropocentric model, that human model of consciousness. Now, are we also agreed that a fish can meet that base level of responsiveness, that robotic thing? Yeah. So now it's just a matter of figuring out where the top is. So it's above, it's a little bit above a plant. It's a series of mechanisms, yeah? A very complex thing on the most basic level. But where does it end? And I think this is the point where you two disagree, is because what Bly is describing is still, he has this existential crisis on this fish. Now, is he just projecting that, or is it possible that the fish is actually, because how else do we explain the behavior of jumping out of the tank? So I think by pinning that down, we can maybe find where the top of fish consciousness is. So would you guys like to take a crack at that? Do you have any objections? I guess, Christopher, what are your objections to Bly's characterization, if any, of his fish being curious?
So I think one main point here that I could grab on would be that you mentioned anthropomorphic or anthropocentric interpretations in refer to this notion of a higher consciousness. But I think that also gets to the heart of what we're doing when we talk about the goldfish as conscious, right? We're comparing, again, as you mentioned, a state that is unknowable. We don't know that the goldfish has even the potential to do this. What we need to rely on is the reflection that in humans and in other animals, we observe this particular phenomenon based on this mechanism. We take away this mechanism, consciousness is gone, right? And that the goldfish lacks that. So I'm just basing it on no knowledge of what actual state the goldfish experiences, which we think is impossible, versus just the closest comparison we have, which is our own state. So I think we also need to be careful to ascribe suicidal thoughts and angst to the goldfish. This is more, that would be similarly anthropomorphic, or yeah, okay.
Or anthropocentric, anthropomorphic.
Anthropocentric, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I want to ask you though, because you brought up this point that we can't know what's going on in the goldfish's mind, right? We can't know that for sure. Exactly. So is your insistence that it is only the things that we can measure because you believe that's all there is, or just because the rest is unknowable?
In this specific instance, it would be that consciousness, unless we link consciousness to specific biological processes, and the arising of consciousness to specific biological processes, the leap forward of assumptions that we have to make goes beyond materialism. We need to assume, and perhaps that is an assumption we should make, but it's, within our current worldview, this is not something we can examine in detail, that we would have to assume that consciousness not only exists as a mysterious condition of the universe, but it is able to interact with matter in a way that we don't observe.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly enough going on in our brains to explain, we might not understand it all, but there's definitely enough activity going on. Bly, do you want to push back on that at all?
Well, I think the important thing to keep in mind is the unknowable aspect of it. We cannot simply assume there's a negative if we admit that it is unknown. Happy's actions are unknowable at the end of the day, but we do see a connection between stimulus and a decision process. In the case of fish who were given morphine, they were given doses of morphine which did not destroy the pain they had, but dulled it. And in the case of having a dulled sense of pain, they began responding to stimuli once again, which would suggest that they comprehend that they feel that they suffer, and they have a sense of suffering, and that is the basis of Russian literature right there. So that's a pretty deep thing. So we certainly can ascribe the Buddha or deeper concepts that are human. For all we know, fish, goldfish included, might have similar equivalents. It is unknowable. Their perception of the world is so vastly different from ours. They live in a world of 3 dimensions, the very basics. They live in the world of 3 dimensions. We tend to live in a world of 2 dimensions. Our perceptions are quite different. And so therefore, what levels of joy or feeling or depth is unknowable. But that is not to immediately discount that it exists. So I would respond in that way.
All right. So I think I've hit on a core difference here, and this is to your earlier point, Bly. Mm-hmm. So when you were saying that when the fish is in pain, it perceives things one way, and when it's not in pain, it perceives things another way, which suggests that we have internal states that are changing. So it's not pure behaviorism, as Christopher is pointing it out, where there's an external input and then there's an externally visible output. That there can be.
The morphine would suggest that it's not a physiological response. Their actions are not physiological. They're mental.
So it's having a sort of a mental state change.
Yes.
It might be a primitive one, but that could be proto-consciousness, if we will. If we're taking Christopher's definition of consciousness as something that sort of looks at all those stimuli and frames it in some way, right? So it's not simply robotic. There's some sort of processing in there that is determining how I'm going to respond to things in the outside world based on how I'm feeling inside.
Yes.
Does that tick your boxes, Christopher? Is it something you are willing to allow, even with your materialistic?
I think we definitely have to allow for degrees of consciousness. And I think that would definitely fall within that as well. And then I would suggest even that we might have to expand downward. So we were setting an upper limit, and then we'd have to question whether, we can consider the possibility of a, forest system, displaying some level of awareness. But again, yeah.
Yeah, there are definitely tons of implications we could explore for this, but I think we've gotten to a definition. So check me and make sure I'm not overstating anything. So the higher end of fish consciousness is a separate awareness that is not manifested in actions, right? It's not manifested behaviorally, but might be manifested internally to the fact that they can respond to external stimuli with internal state changes, where they feel happy, maybe, or sad, or at least in pain or not in pain. But Christopher's point is we should be wary that we don't superimpose too much, we don't read too much into that. The fact that there is this state, this internal state, might be the seed from which our much more complicated states grow. But we can't attribute, understanding of the Buddha to them. But we can maybe think that a fish could understand pain and maybe even, more complex things, perhaps. So we know that it can feel pain. We know that it's a responding bot, and we know that it has some sort of internal state. And we can't say for sure whether it doesn't have more. But if it does, it's probably very simple compared to what we have, because its brain is very simple. And we all are agreed that we're talking about a materialistic account here. Bly is not pushing for a spirit to come in and save the fish.
I wish I could, but I will deal with what the truth is for now.
Okay, so if I can put it in a sentence, goldfish consciousness is an internal state that influences how it responds to other sense perceptions. Mm-hmm. Does that work?
Yeah. That works.
Yeah, so that's the high end, and the low end, I think we're all agreed. I mean, it goes down to everything from basic responsiveness to up to this is as high as the goldfish can go. All right, cool. Yeah, we did it. Let's see how on time.
Right.
I think we still have a couple of minutes. Would you guys like to just because we have a few minutes and we're going to discuss this in class? Could we? So this definition of consciousness, do you think that is a necessary condition? This level where is everything that's a person? Is that a necessary condition for personhood? Does every person need to have this thing?
Yes.
Yeah, I would agree. For that definition, for that word personhood to have meaning, it needs to have a certain necessary conditions. And I think consciousness, like whatever we mean again by degrees of that, or wakefulness, degrees of wakefulness, or sleeping, whatever, there has to be at least the awake or kind of internal state going on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, cool. I tend to agree. But here's the much harder question: is it sufficient? Is this enough to make a goldfish a person?
From a purely legal standpoint, as far as the rules and laws of human society, it is not. I would have to admit that. When Happy first disappeared, we did not know of where he was for a period of time. The cat was instantly blamed for the disappearance of Happy, and we were not in a position to punish the cat overly for what it had done. Because Happy's personhood was not a thing that reached the level of needing to punish the cat by removing its life or imprisoning it or throwing it out of the house. So even in the case of a much beloved Happy, his personhood status was not deeply affected by when we thought it was the cat who had killed him.
Okay, so maybe his personhood status is worthy of at most sympathy, perhaps empathy, however misguided, but not any sort of actual enforceable right. Do you agree?
And I have to say that upon discovering Happy behind the couch, that is when the empathy kicked in. This idea that there was something that he was trying to achieve, and whether he gloriously failed or gloriously succeeded, There is no way to know because it is unknowable, but that did inspire an empathetic feeling for Happy's goals and plans and personhood. So yes.
Fantastic. Christopher, do you agree with that assessment?
So I do partially agree with that. I would again emphasize the idea of degrees here, and specifically the degree of experience and the degree of inner experience. I would like to kind of paraphrase, and this is something I knew a long time ago, but paraphrase one of Peter Singer's arguments in terms of the capacity to feel fear as being something required in order to understand that we should be able to identify and view another being as a person, or at least needing our respect as a fellow conscious being. So if we're going to define personhood as something where we define another being as having, the same respect toward us in terms of what you guys said with empathy, especially in regard to fear and pain and the active experiences of fear and pain. So I think that for me is maybe a starting point for setting the idea of consciousness. But again, that would be somewhat dependent possibly on degrees, but that may not exclude things, just basic experiences such as pain.
Yeah. Oh, well, this is actually a reverse of what I thought it would be. I would assume that the Bly would be the one arguing that it is sufficient, and Christopher would be the one argue that it isn't sufficient, because normally if you're trying to no, that's fine, because it just shows you guys have been thinking and listening to each other, which is what arbitrated debates are all about. They're not about winning. So that's wonderful. Thank you guys so much for helping me understand goldfish consciousness, and thank you. This was perfect.
Okay.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
And more of Happy. Yes.
For poor